The solicitor arrived at Thornhallow Estate on a Tuesday morning, when the April fog still clung to the Yorkshire moors, like gauze wrapped around a wound. Thomas Ashworth had handled property transfers for 30 years, and in that time, he had learned to read buildings the way other men read ledgers. A house told you things, if you knew how to listen. The Whitmore Home for Foundlings had been telling him things since he stepped through its gates. It was smaller than he'd expected. The newspaper illustrations had always depicted it as grand, a beacon of Victorian philanthropy, the crown jewel of the Whitmore family's charitable legacy. But standing before it now, with the building emptied of purpose and the last of the children relocated to the county home in Leeds, Thomas saw it for what it truly was: a plain brick institution, 3 stories tall, set against a hill that blocked the morning sun. The windows were narrow, the grounds were sparse. There was nothing welcoming about it at all. He had been hired by the new owners, an industrialist from Manchester, who planned to convert the property into a textile warehouse, to conduct a final survey before renovation crews arrived. Standard work. Measure the rooms, note the structural concerns, catalog anything of value left behind. What Thomas did not expect was the smell. It hit him the moment he unlocked the main door. A thickness in the air, damp and close, as if the building had been holding its breath for years and had finally exhaled. Not decay, exactly. Something older. Something that had seeped into the walls themselves. He moved through the ground floor methodically. The receiving hall, the matron's office, the dining room with its long wooden tables still bolted to the floor, scratched by decades of tin plates and small, restless hands. Each room matched the architectural plans he'd been provided, down to the inch. The building was unremarkable in every measurable way. And yet, Thomas paused in the corridor that connected the east wing to the west. The plans showed this passage as a simple throughway, 32 feet of whitewashed brick. But as he walked its length, counting his steps out of professional habit, the numbers didn't match. The corridor was shorter than the plans indicated by nearly 8 feet. 8 feet of building, simply missing. He stopped, pressed his palm against the wall. The brick was cold, colder than the rest of the building, as though it faced something other than earth on the other side. The workmen arrived 2 days later. Thomas had spent those intervening hours in his Leeds office, unable to shake the feeling that he had overlooked something essential. He reviewed the original architectural drawings, commissioned in 1871, when Cornelius Whitmore first announced his intention to build a model institution for the care of orphaned and abandoned children. The plans bore the stamp of Edinburgh's most respected firm. Every measurement was precise, every room accounted for, except that the building Thomas had walked did not match the building on paper. He told himself there were reasonable explanations. Modifications made over the years, errors in transcription. Buildings changed, after all. They were living things in their way. But when the first workman's hammer struck the corridor wall and the brick crumbled to reveal not earth, not foundation, but a narrow wooden door, painted the exact color of the surrounding stone, invisible unless you knew to look, Thomas understood that the Whitmore home had been designed to hide something from the very beginning. The door was locked. The workman looked to Thomas, uncertain. He produced the ring of keys the estate agent had provided, 14 in all, each labeled in faded ink. None of them fit. "Break it," Thomas said. His voice was steadier than he felt. The door gave way after 3 blows. Behind it, a staircase, narrow and descending, cut directly into the Yorkshire bedrock. The walls were rough stone, unfinished, so different from the institutional tidiness of the floors above. Thomas took a lantern from one of the men and began to descend. 17 steps. He counted each one. At the bottom, a small anteroom, perhaps 6 feet square. And beyond that, another door. This one heavier, reinforced with iron bands, fitted with a lock that looked like it belonged in a prison cell. The key to this door was on his ring. It was the only unmarked one. The one he had assumed opened nothing important. The mechanism turned with a sound like a sigh. The room beyond was perhaps 15 feet by 20. The ceiling was low. Thomas, who was not a tall man, could touch it with his raised hand. The walls had been whitewashed at some point, though the damp had turned them gray and mottled. There were no windows, no ventilation that he could see. The air was stale, carrying that same thick smell from above, concentrated now to something almost unbearable. Along one wall, a row of iron rings, bolted into the stone at intervals of roughly 2 feet. Below each ring, grooves worn into the floor. The kind of grooves made by something or someone shifting against the same spot over and over for a very long time. Along the opposite wall, a wooden cabinet. Thomas approached it slowly, as though the furniture itself might be dangerous. Inside, he found restraints. Leather cuffs sized for wrists no larger than a child's. Metal shackles. A thick leather strap with a wooden handle, its surface darkened by use. And on the bottom shelf, stacked with military precision, a set of ledgers, their spines labeled by year. 1872, 1873, 1874. All the way to 1899, the year Cornelius Whitmore had died in his bed, mourned by the entire county as a great benefactor of the poor. Thomas opened the first ledger. The handwriting was neat, educated, and methodical. Each entry followed the same format: a date, a name, an infraction, and a duration. 14th of March, 1872. Mary Brennan, age 9. Insolence during inspection. 4 hours. 22nd of March, 1872. Thomas Holt, age 7. Failure to meet daily quota. 6 hours. 3rd of April, 1872. Sarah Webb, age 11. Attempted communication with visitors. Overnight. Thomas turned the pages. The entries continued, hundreds of them, thousands across the decades. The names changed. The infractions varied. But the structure remained constant. Transgression and punishment, cause and effect, recorded with the same dispassionate precision one might use to track inventory. Daily quota. The phrase appeared again and again. He did not yet understand what it meant, but he understood that whatever had happened in this cellar was not an aberration. It was a system. He closed the ledger. His hands were shaking. In the far corner of the room, almost invisible in the lantern's unsteady light, he noticed something else. A loose stone in the wall, set slightly apart from the others. He crossed to it, knelt, and worked it free with his fingers. Behind the stone was a hollow space, and inside the hollow, wrapped in a scrap of cloth that had once been white, a collection of small objects: a wooden button, a lock of hair tied with thread, a scrap of paper folded into a tiny square, a tooth, small and milk white, clearly belonging to a child. Thomas unfolded the paper. The handwriting was childish, uncertain, but the words were clear. My name is Ellen Price. I am 13 years old. If you find this, please know that we were here. Please remember us. He sat back on his heels. Above him, he could hear the workmen calling to each other, their voices muffled by stone and earth. They didn't know what lay beneath their feet. They didn't know that the building they were preparing to gut had been, for nearly 30 years, something far worse than an orphanage. Thomas Ashworth had handled property transfers for 30 years. He had seen neglect. He had seen poverty. He had seen the quiet cruelties that poverty breeds. He had never seen anything like this. The day the Whitmore Home for Foundlings opened its doors, all of Yorkshire celebrated. Cornelius Whitmore had made his fortune in textiles, cotton primarily, processed in mills he owned throughout the north. He was not a self-made man. His father had built the foundation. But Cornelius had expanded the empire, modernized the equipment, streamlined the labor. By 1870, Whitmore Mills employed over 3,000 workers and produced enough fabric to clothe half the empire. He was also, by all public accounts, a deeply charitable man. The orphanage had been announced at a gala dinner the previous spring. Cornelius had risen from his seat at the head table, his wife Harriet beside him, and spoken with what witnesses described as genuine emotion about the plight of England's forgotten children. "There are thousands of young souls," he had said, "who through no fault of their own have been cast into darkness. It is our duty, our sacred obligation, to provide them with light." The newspapers had printed every word. The Queen herself had sent a letter of commendation. When the building was completed 18 months later, built on a parcel of the Whitmore Estate that Cornelius donated for the purpose, the opening ceremony drew dignitaries from across the country. No one toured the cellar. The cellar did not appear on any of the plans shown to visitors. As far as the public knew, the Whitmore home consisted of dormitories, classrooms, a dining hall, and a small chapel. Everything a modern institution required to transform destitute children into productive members of society. The first children arrived in October, 23 of them, ranging in age from 5 to 14, drawn from workhouses and parish rolls across Yorkshire. They were scrubbed, clothed in identical gray uniforms, and lined up in the receiving hall to meet their benefactors. Harriet Whitmore greeted each one personally. She was a small woman, pale and thin-lipped, with the kind of careful prettiness that suggested constant maintenance. She smiled as she shook their hands. She asked their names. She told them they were safe now, that they had been given a great gift, that all she asked in return was obedience and hard work. "This is your home," she said. "We are your family, and families look after one another." The children nodded. They had no reason to doubt her. Most of them had never known kindness from adults who did not want something in return. And Mrs. Whitmore's words sounded to their untrained ears like kindness. The work began the next morning. The east wing, which visitors never saw, had been converted into a workshop. Long wooden tables filled the space, each fitted with the tools of textile finishing: needles, thread, scissors, spools of ribbon. The windows, what few there were, had been covered with heavy cloth to prevent distractions. The children worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Their task was simple: hand-finishing garments that had been assembled in the Whitmore mills, sewing buttons, trimming threads, adding decorative touches that machines could not replicate. It was delicate work, and small fingers were ideally suited to it. Each child was assigned a daily quota. The number varied by age and skill, but the principle was absolute: finish your work or face consequences. The consequences were never specified. They didn't need to be. The first child to fail her quota was a girl named Mary Brennan. She was 9 years old, with red hair that she kept tucked beneath her cap, and she had been at the home for 3 weeks when her hands began to cramp. The work required constant fine motor movement, threading needles, manipulating tiny buttons, making stitches so small they were nearly invisible. By the end of her third week, Mary's fingers ached constantly. She could not maintain speed. Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the workshop that evening. She did not raise her voice. She did not strike Mary or threaten her. She simply took the girl by the hand and led her out of the room, down the corridor, and through a door that the children had been told led to a storage cellar. When Mary returned the next morning, she would not speak of what had happened. She took her seat at the workbench. She picked up her needle, and she met her quota that day and every day after, until her fingers bled, and the blood stained the white fabric she was meant to keep pristine. The other children watched. They learned. The public face of the Whitmore home remained immaculate. Cornelius arranged regular tours for potential donors, during which the workshop wing was locked, and the children were assembled in the classroom, dressed in their cleanest uniforms, reciting lessons they had memorized for the occasion. The dormitories were shown, rows of neat beds, each with a folded blanket and a small pillow. The dining hall was shown, tables set with tin plates and cups, as though a wholesome meal were about to be served. What was not shown? The actual dormitories, which held twice as many beds as the display room, stacked in bunks that left no space for privacy or rest. The actual meals, which consisted of thin porridge in the morning, bread and dripping at midday, and whatever scraps the kitchen could produce in the evening. The actual education, which amounted to an hour of reading instruction on Sundays, conducted by a local pastor who believed that literacy was a dangerous thing in the hands of the poor. The Whitmores had built a machine. The children were its fuel. The garments they produced were shipped to London, where they were sold under a fashionable label that commanded premium prices. The customers who purchased them never knew that the delicate embroidery on their cuffs had been stitched by hands too small to hold a pen. And beneath the floors, in a room that appeared on no blueprint, the system maintained itself through fear. Ellen Price arrived at the Whitmore home on her 7th birthday. She did not know it was her birthday. The workhouse where she had spent her earliest years did not mark such occasions. But her mother, before she died of consumption in the winter of 1885, had told Ellen the date, the 12th of March, and Ellen had held onto that knowledge the way other children held onto toys or blankets. It was hers. It could not be taken. The home seemed grand to her at first. The workhouse had been a single large room, cold and crowded, where children slept on straw and ate whatever the parish provided. The Whitmore home had actual beds, actual walls between rooms, windows, even if they were small. Ellen thought she had been rescued. The illusion lasted 3 days. On her 4th morning, Ellen was assigned to the workshop. Her task was simple: sew buttons onto shirt cuffs, 5 buttons per cuff, 2 cuffs per shirt, 40 shirts per day. 200 buttons, each requiring 4 stitches, each stitch requiring precision that her small, unpracticed hands could not yet achieve. She finished 31 shirts that first day. The matron, a woman named Mrs. Graves, whose name seemed chosen for cruelty, marked the number in a ledger without comment. Ellen was not punished, not yet. New children were given a week to learn. By the end of that week, Ellen could finish 38 shirts. Close, but not enough. Mrs. Graves took her by the wrist and led her down the corridor, through the door that the older children refused to discuss, down the stairs that Ellen had not known existed. The cellar was dark. The air was thick. There were other children already there, 2 of them, a boy and a girl, chained to the wall by their wrists. They did not look at Ellen. They had learned not to look. Mrs. Graves attached Ellen to the 3rd ring. The metal cuff was cold against her skin, sized for a wrist slightly larger than hers, so that it could not be slipped off, but also could not be worn without awareness. Ellen was left in darkness for 6 hours. She could hear the other children breathing. She could hear, faintly, the sounds of the workshop above, the rhythm of needles and thread, the occasional cough or shuffle, life continuing without her. When she was released, she met her quota. Every day after, she met her quota. She did not think about what it cost her. The ache in her fingers, the burning in her eyes, the hunger that never quite went away. She thought only about the cellar and how to never return to it. Years passed. Ellen grew. By the time she was 11, she was one of the most skilled workers in the home. Fast, precise, reliable. Mrs. Graves began assigning her to the most delicate work: embroidery, lacework, the finishing touches that distinguished Whitmore garments from their competitors. She had also learned things that younger children did not know. The home had been operating for 20 years. In that time, over 400 children had passed through its doors. Some had aged out at 14, released into domestic service or factory work. Some had died of illness, the official records said, though the children whispered darker theories. And some had simply vanished, their beds empty one morning, their names never spoken again. Ellen had learned to notice things. She noticed that Mrs. Whitmore visited the cellar personally, sometimes, for discipline sessions that lasted longer than Mrs. Graves's. She noticed that certain children, the ones who asked questions, who complained, who failed to show proper gratitude, were the ones most likely to disappear. She noticed that the ledgers Mrs. Graves kept were meticulous, obsessive, as though documenting everything was a form of protection. And she noticed gradually that the world outside the home had no idea what happened within it. Visitors came regularly: donors, clergy, the occasional journalist writing favorable pieces about charitable institutions. They toured the display rooms. They shook hands with carefully selected children who had been coached to smile and say thank you. They left believing they had seen evidence of good work being done. Ellen watched these visitors with something that felt like desperation. If she could speak to one of them, really speak, not the scripted responses they were taught, she might be able to convey the truth, but speaking was impossible. The children were never left alone with visitors, and the punishment for unauthorized communication was severe. The ledger from 1887 recorded Sarah Webb, age 11, attempted communication with visitors overnight. Sarah Webb had been one of the ones who disappeared. In the autumn of 1891, when Ellen was 12 years old, a new child arrived at the home. Her name was Clara, and she was 6 years old, and she cried every night for her mother. The other children ignored her. Tears were common in new arrivals, and sympathy was a resource none of them could afford. But Ellen found herself drawn to Clara in a way she could not explain. Perhaps it was the girl's age, the same age Ellen had been when she arrived. Perhaps it was the particular quality of her grief, which seemed somehow purer than the numbed resignation of children who had been abandoned from birth. Clara had been loved once. She remembered what that felt like. Ellen began sitting next to Clara at meals. She did not speak. Speaking attracted attention, but she offered small gestures: a hand on the shoulder, a nod of encouragement, the gift of her own bread when Clara's portions were taken by larger children. Kindness, carefully measured, invisible to adult eyes. Clara learned faster than most. By her 3rd week, she was meeting her quota. By her 2nd month, she had stopped crying at night. But there was something in her eyes that worried Ellen. a brightness, a defiance that the home had not yet managed to extinguish. "Why do we do this?" Clara whispered one night, when the dormitory was dark and the matron's footsteps had faded down the hall. "The work. Why?" Ellen did not answer. Some questions were too dangerous to acknowledge. "They sell the things we make," Clara continued. "I heard Mrs. Graves talking. They sell them for money, but we never see any money. We never see anything." "Quiet," Ellen breathed. "Please." Clara was quiet, but the question hung in the air between them, unanswered, impossible to forget. Why? It was the most dangerous word in the home. Why do we work? Why do we suffer? Why does no one help us? Why had become, for Ellen, the shape of her own secret rebellion. Ellen began planning her escape in January. Not her own escape. She knew that was impossible. Children who ran were always caught. The home sat on Whitmore land, miles from the nearest village, and the local constabulary had been trained to return runaways without question. No, Ellen's escape was different. She would send her voice out into the world, even if her body remained trapped. She had been saving materials for months. A stub of pencil, discarded by Mrs. Graves and retrieved from the waste bin. Scraps of paper, the margins of damaged patterns, the backs of labels, anything that could hold writing. She hid these treasures in the lining of her mattress, where the straw was thickest, where inspections rarely probed. Writing was not taught at the home, not really. The Sunday lessons covered only the basics, enough to read scripture, not enough to compose thoughts. But Ellen had taught herself, late at night, tracing letters in the dust of her bed frame, until she could form words. It was slow. It was imperfect. It was hers. The first draft of her letter took 3 weeks to complete. She wrote it in fragments, a sentence at a time, whenever she could be certain of privacy. The words felt inadequate. How could language convey the cellar, the quotas, the way hope had been systematically stripped from every child who passed through these doors? But inadequate words were better than silence. To whoever finds this letter, my name is Ellen Price. I am 13 years old, and I have lived at the Whitmore Home for Foundlings for 6 years. I am writing to tell you the truth about this place. The Whitmores call it a charity. They tell people we are cared for, but we are not children here. We are workers. We make clothes from morning until night, and we are punished if we do not make enough. The punishment happens in a room underground that no one knows about. Children are chained there. I have been chained there. I am writing this because I do not think I will ever leave this place alive. Some children age out and are sent away. Some children die. Some children disappear, and no one says where they went. I do not know what will happen to me, but I want someone to know we were here. I want someone to remember our names. Please. If you find this letter, tell someone. Tell everyone. Do not let them forget us. Ellen Price. The question was how to get the letter out. Children were not permitted to send correspondence. Visitors were closely supervised. The gates were locked. Every avenue of communication had been sealed by design. Ellen considered and rejected a dozen plans. She thought of hiding the letter in a finished garment, hoping it would be discovered by whoever purchased it. But the garments were inspected before shipping. She thought of throwing it over the wall when the delivery wagons came, but the grounds were watched. She thought of confiding in one of the servants, but the servants were as afraid of the Whitmores as the children were. In the end, she chose the only option that seemed to offer any chance at all. She would hide the letter in the cellar itself. It was a gamble. The cellar might never be discovered. The letter might rot there for decades, centuries. its message dissolving into nothing. But Ellen had observed something during her years at the home. Buildings outlast people. The Whitmores would die someday. The home would close, or change, or be sold. And when it did, someone would find the room beneath the floor. She would leave her voice where it could not be silenced. Getting into the cellar was easier than it should have been. Ellen failed her quota deliberately. A small act of sabotage that felt enormous. A betrayal of every survival instinct she had developed. Mrs. Graves marked her ledger. The door opened. The stairs descended. She was alone this time. The cellar was empty, except for the rings, the cabinet, the oppressive darkness that seemed to press against her skin. Ellen worked quickly, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain someone would hear. She found a loose stone in the corner. She had noticed it on a previous visit, had remembered it, had planned for this moment. She wrapped the letter in a scrap of cloth, along with a few other items she had collected. A button from Clara's first completed garment, a lock of her own hair, a tooth she had lost 2 years ago and kept for reasons she could not explain. Evidence. Proof that they had existed. Proof that they had suffered. Proof that someone, at least, had tried to speak. She replaced the stone and settled against the wall to wait out her punishment. 6 hours this time, the standard duration for a first offense. Long enough for her muscles to cramp. Long enough for the darkness to feel like a living thing, wrapping itself around her. Long enough to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. But when Mrs. Graves came to release her, Ellen felt something she had not felt in years. Not hope, exactly. Something harder, more durable. Defiance. Thomas Ashworth spent 2 weeks investigating the Whitmore home before he contacted the authorities. He told himself he needed evidence. The ledgers were damning, but ledgers could be fabricated. The restraints were suggestive, but they proved nothing about who had worn them or why. The letter, Ellen's letter, was heartbreaking, but it was the testimony of a child, and children were not considered reliable witnesses. What he really needed, he knew, was time. Time to understand what he had found. Time to reckon with the fact that the Whitmore family, respected, admired, mourned, had built their reputation on the suffering of children. He began by tracing names. The ledgers provided hundreds of them, along with dates of arrival and departure. Thomas cross-referenced these with parish records, workhouse registers, census data. The work was tedious, but it yielded results. Mary Brennan, the first child punished in the cellar, had died of pneumonia in 1879. She was 16. Thomas Holt, who failed to meet his quota in March of 1872, had been released into factory, work at 14, and died in a mill accident 3 years later. Sarah Webb, who attempted communication with a visitor, appeared in no records after 1887. She had simply ceased to exist. And Ellen Price, the girl who had written the letter, who had hidden her voice beneath a loose stone, hoping someone would hear. Ellen had aged out of the home in 1893, shortly after her 14th birthday. The records showed her being placed in domestic service with a family in Sheffield. But the Sheffield family had no record of ever employing her. The trail went cold. Thomas searched for weeks, following every thread he could find. He wrote letters to parish clerks. He visited workhouses. He placed discreet inquiries in the Sheffield newspapers, asking for information about a woman named Ellen Price, who might have been in service around 1893. The reply came in May, nearly 2 months after his initial discovery. Ellen Price was alive. She was 22 years old, married to a clerk named William Harper, living in a modest house in the Attercliffe district of Sheffield. She had 3 children of her own, 2 boys and a girl, and she worked part-time as a seamstress, her skills honed by years of enforced practice. Thomas visited her on a Thursday afternoon. He brought the letter with him, wrapped in the same cloth Ellen had used 9 years before. When he showed it to her, she went very still. "You found it," she said. Her voice was soft, careful, as though loud sounds might shatter something fragile. "After all this time." "I found everything," Thomas said. "The cellar, the ledgers, the restraints." He paused. "I need to know if what you wrote was true." Ellen looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were gray, the color of Yorkshire stone, and they held a weight that seemed older than her years. "Every word," she said. "Every word was true." She told him the rest. The quotas, the punishments, the children who disappeared, the visitors who saw nothing because nothing was shown to them, the Whitmores, who smiled for photographers and spoke of Christian duty while their fortune grew on the labor of hands too small to resist. "I thought no one would ever know," Ellen said. "I thought we would all be forgotten. Just names in a ledger, if that." Thomas thought of the children's items he had found behind the loose stone, the button, the lock of hair, the tooth. Small things, almost worthless, preserved with desperate care because they were all the children had. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Ellen did not hesitate. "Tell everyone," she said. "Make them remember." The investigation that followed was the largest of its kind in the Yorkshire history. Thomas Ashworth presented his findings to the county magistrate, along with Ellen's testimony and the testimonies of 6 other survivors he had managed to locate. The ledgers were examined by handwriting experts who confirmed they matched known samples of Mrs. Whitmore's hand. The cellar was photographed, measured, documented in excruciating detail. Cornelius Whitmore was beyond earthly justice. He had died in 1899, praised in obituaries as one of Yorkshire's great benefactors. But Harriet Whitmore was alive, living in comfortable retirement on the family estate. She was arrested in June of 1901 and charged with false imprisonment, child cruelty, and fraud. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The newspapers, which had once printed glowing accounts of the Whitmore charity, now competed to expose its horrors. Survivors came forward, dozens of them, men and women who had carried their memories in silence for years, finally given permission to speak. Harriet Whitmore maintained her innocence throughout. "The children had been ungrateful," she said. "The work had been educational. The cellar had been a necessary disciplinary measure, no different from what any parent might employ. She had acted out of love." The jury did not believe her. She was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. She died there in 1908, alone, unmourned, her name a synonym for hypocrisy in the Yorkshire press. The Whitmore fortune was seized by the courts and distributed to survivors and their families. The estate was sold. The orphanage building was demolished in 1903, razed to the ground so that nothing remained but foundation stones and memory. But before it fell, someone, no one recorded who, carved a message into the doorframe of the cellar entrance. It was discovered when the demolition crews cleared the last of the rubble, and it was preserved eventually in the Yorkshire County Museum, where it remains to this day. The message reads, "We were here." Ellen Price Harper died on the 12th of March, 1912, her 47th birthday, though she had stopped counting birthdays long ago. She was surrounded by her children and grandchildren in the home she and William had built together, in a room filled with light. In her final years, she had become something of a local figure. The trial had made her name public, and people sought her out. Journalists, reformers, curious strangers who wanted to hear her story firsthand. She told it when she could, though she found that the telling never got easier. Some memories do not soften with time. They only grow sharper, harder, more permanent. But she told it anyway, because telling was the only weapon she had ever possessed. Clara, the girl Ellen had protected in the dormitory all those years ago, came to the funeral. She was 31 now, a teacher at a school in Leeds, unmarried by choice, devoted to work she believed in. She had aged out of the home 3 years after Ellen, and they had found each other again through the trial. Two survivors recognizing each other across a crowded courtroom. "She saved me," Clara told the mourners. "She taught me that even in the darkest places, kindness is possible. That we can choose to be different from the cruelty we've known." Thomas Ashworth was there too. He was 64 years old, retired from the law, and he had never forgotten the day he broke through that hidden door and descended into the darkness below the Whitmore home. It had changed him. It had made him question everything he thought he knew about the world, about charity, about reputation, about the distance between public virtue and private sin. He had kept Ellen's original letter all these years. It sat in a frame on his desk, a reminder that truth is sometimes hidden in the most unlikely places, waiting for someone to look. After the funeral, when the other mourners had departed and the house had grown quiet, Thomas sat alone in Ellen's parlor. Her daughter had given him permission to stay as long as he needed. The room was modest, a working-class home, nothing like the grand estates where the Whitmores had lived. But it was warm and clean and full of the small evidence of a life well lived. Photographs on the mantel, needlework on the chairs, books on the shelves, many of them purchased secondhand, their spines cracked from reading and rereading. Ellen had built something here. Out of nothing, out of worse than nothing. She had built a family, a home, a self. She had refused to let the Whitmore home define her. She had refused to be silent. Thomas thought about the other children, the ones who had not survived. Mary Brennan, dead at 16. Sarah Webb, vanished without a trace. All the names in the ledgers, all the souls who had passed through that building and emerged broken, or not at all. He thought about Cornelius and Harriet Whitmore, who had built their reputation on suffering and smiled for the cameras while children bled in their workshops. He thought about the visitors who had seen only what they were shown, the donors who had funded cruelty with their charitable contributions, the society that had praised the Whitmores as paragons of Christian virtue. Evil, Thomas had learned, rarely announced itself. It dressed in respectability. It spoke the language of good intentions. It hid behind locked doors and falsified records, and the convenient assumption that wealthy people must be moral people. The only defense against it was attention. Looking, listening, refusing to accept the surfaces of things. Ellen Price had understood this at 13 years old, sitting in a cellar with a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil, writing words she did not know anyone would ever read. She had understood that silence was complicity, that forgetting was a form of betrayal, that the only thing worse than suffering was suffering without witness. "My name is Ellen Price," she had written. "Please know that we were here. Please remember us." Thomas rose from his chair. He walked to the window and looked out at the street where ordinary people were going about their ordinary lives, unaware of the woman who had just died or the story she had carried. The sun was setting over Sheffield. painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. "I remember," he said, "to no one and everyone. I remember." And somewhere in the Yorkshire County Museum, behind glass, a carved message waited for the next person who needed to hear it. We were here.